In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Can the Minister confirm that 2 elderly Queensland aged care residents have been given an overdose of the COVID-19 vaccine by a doctor contracted through the government, with one of those residents being hospitalised? Can the Minister advise the House what steps the government has taken to ensure that all health professionals administering the COVID-19 vaccine are suitably qualified and trained?
The Minister for Health.
7 years at university.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to answer the question. As advised with the Chief Medical Officer earlier today, the government was notified yesterday evening that indeed 2 patients were provided with a higher than the prescribed dose level. This was done in breach of the advice. The advice that I have from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, who has conducted an investigation and provided a preliminary report, is firstly that the doctor in question was fully registered with AHPRA, had all credentials met, and had indeed, and this has been confirmed both by the provider and through examination of electronic records, completed the full training. That training module, of course, involves ensuring that dose administration is carried out, that all stages are carried out, the proper techniques for drawing up doses, the supervisory roles. So all elements of the training which could have been done and could have been required were put in place. Most significantly, the #1 focus has been on the health of the patients. In fact, at the advice of authorities, both patients are being monitored in hospital, and I think that that's appropriate. We spoke with the Queensland Government last night, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Medical Officer and myself, with our respective counterparts. In essence, the training of this Australian-trained doctor, the credentials of this Australian-trained doctor and the specific training of this Australian-trained doctor were all carried out in accordance with procedures. Every one of those steps has been checked and rechecked, and none of those steps had been breached. The advice that we have from the Deputy Chief Medical Officer is very simple. The doctor involved did the wrong thing, and that is a case of human error, a case of unacceptable human error. And so, as a consequence of that, the doctor was stood down. The relevant body, HCA, has been in dialogue with the government today to make sure that all possible steps can and should be taken to ensure this never occurs again. However, all of the necessary required steps involving training were carried out. So we apologise to the families involved. The important thing, and we make that sincerely, the important thing is this is an individual act of human error, and we've seen at many times in many circumstances that whilst a system can prepare, if an individual takes a step, it's then how we respond. And there were 3 sets of safeguards put in place. All were brought into being: the nurse, the provider and the government taking those steps to protect these patients.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is ensuring big technology companies operate in line with Australian laws and values, and why this is important to Australia's future?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Sturt for his question. He knows, like I do, and I think all of us in this place, that big tech companies may be changing the world, but they shouldn't run it, Mr Speaker. They shouldn't run it. They should be subject to the rule of law in the nations in which they operate, Mr Speaker. But importantly, nations must stand up for themselves when it comes to that rule of law and how it must apply to those big tech companies, Mr Speaker. And under our government, that's exactly what Australia has done. Mr Speaker, over many years now, Australia has been taking forward these matters, and I can go back to Treasurer Hockey, Mr Speaker, through the G20 process when the base erosion and profit-shifting tax measures to take seriously the issue of ensuring that multinationals and particularly big technology companies pay more tax and pay their fair share of tax, Mr Speaker. Those laws were passed by this parliament with the support of this government, and were actually opposed by the Labor Party at the time, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, on top of that, though, we initiated in 2017, when I was Treasurer, Mr Speaker, a groundbreaking review by the ACCC. This was the most significant look into the global market power of big technology companies that we had seen. Mr Speaker, these were the issues that we have been advocating in global forums on antitrust and competition laws, not just on taxation laws, to ensure we take the big technology companies and large multinationals to account. We've introduced tougher tax laws and given our tax office greater powers like they have never had before in relation to these companies. We pursued the low threshold arrangement on companies like Amazon. They left, Mr Speaker, in protest, and they came crawling back, Mr Speaker, because our government held its ground, Mr Speaker. We have taken up globally the issue of the takedown of terrorist and extreme content on the social media platforms, and we have led the world through that process with many other partners, including New Zealand and Canada, who I acknowledge. But, Mr Speaker, on this particular issue, we are not going to let big tech companies take a free ride on our free press. That's not what we're going to allow, and we haven't allowed that. The measures we've introduced into this place, Mr Speaker, and holding these companies to account shows the strength of resolve of our government to stand up for the things that are important to Australia. Those values of a free press, which are so essential to our democracy. Australia has led the world in standing up for itself, standing up for the rule of law and standing up for citizens of free peoples, Mr Speaker, to ensure that big tech companies get the message, make the changes and adhere to the laws of free democracies, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. And I ask, can the Prime Minister confirm that the government has lost its majority on the floor of the House and for confidence now depends on the vote of a crossbench conspiracy theorist who's pushing discredited and dangerous treatments during a health pandemic?
The first part of the question's in order. The Prime Minister has the call.
What I know, Mr Speaker, is there more of us on this side than there are more of them on that side, Mr Speaker. And you know who made that decision? The Australian people, Mr Speaker. At the last election, we went to that election, Mr Speaker, and the Australian people rejected the Labor Party to become the government of this country, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. There's actually 75 there and 75 here. 75 here and 75 there. The
Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Minister for Agriculture and the Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At the last election, the Australian people rejected the Labor Party to govern this country and to control this chamber, Mr Speaker. They rejected that, the Australian people, Mr Speaker, and I know that the members of this chamber understand that, even if the Leader of the Opposition still can't come to terms with the fact that at the last election, Mr Speaker, their $375 billion and more of higher taxes, they said no to me. 387, I'm corrected by the Treasurer. It indeed was higher than that, Mr Speaker. Their phony class wall, Mr Speaker, they rejected, Mr Speaker. They rejected their poor fiscal management credentials and they said, we do not want the Labor Party to run this country, Mr Speaker. And so each and every day, from that election to now, Mr Speaker, we have held faith with the promise that we made to the Australian people and that they backed us on at that last election, and we will continue to do that, Mr Speaker. But if the Leader of the Opposition wants to test the issue that he seems to so boldly, with his back turned to me now, Mr Speaker, that he seems to like to so boldly puff out his chest on today, Mr Speaker. If he thinks that he has control of this House, Mr Speaker, I invite him to move the relevant motion or stop showing off.
The member for Dawson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison-McCormick government is delivering essential infrastructure for Australians living in regional communities?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the member for Dawson fully understands the value of water and what a difference it makes to regional communities, how important, how integral it is to making those regional communities grow. Indeed, in last year's budget, we added an extra $2 billion to the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund. Our commitment currently stands at $3.5 billion to build dams, to build pipelines, to build weirs right across the country, to build on the national water grid's work. Water infrastructure and water security connects, links and empowers regional Australians like nothing else. And we have already committed more than $1.7 billion to co-fund the construction of more than 20 water infrastructure projects with a total construction value of more than $2.7 billion. That's going to create opportunities. That's going to create jobs in regional Australia. It is unlocking the potential of agriculture. And you only have to listen to the Minister for Agriculture talk about how water grows the food and fibre worth of our nation to indeed create more jobs, to indeed create more trade. We've already completed 6 projects which are now operating since the water grid was established in October 2019. We have another 2 projects nearing completion. We are investing in the 10-year pipeline of infrastructure development, water projects through feasibility studies, through detailed business cases. We are getting on with the job. Now, in the member for Dawson's great state of Queensland, there are unlimited opportunities to develop new water infrastructure, and we're looking at each and every one of them. In his and the member for Capricornia's electorate, the Urana Dam project is well advanced, and we've put $10 million for the detailed business case towards just that. Andrew Wilcox, the Mayor of Whitsunday Regional Council, said about Urana, "I've always said to make magic happen, you just add water. And this project will create employment magic with over 1,000 jobs during construction and more than 600 permanent jobs when operational." He continued, "Urana Dam will provide a fantastic boost for our agriculture and mining industries and be a real catalyst project for our region." Now, we've committed to the construction of Big Rocks Weir near Charters Towers. We're well progressed on the detailed business cases for Hewenden and Hells Gate in North Queensland. $352 million towards Rookwood Weir. It's under construction in the member for Flynn and Capricornia's electorates. $84 million. I know the member for Maranoa is very excited about this. The Emu Swamp Dam near Stanthorpe in Maranoa in the final planning stages. We're getting on with the job before the construction commences. These projects are creating opportunity, they're creating hope, and they're going to build regional Australia like nothing else.
Member for Griffith. The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his answers yesterday. How can the Prime Minister claim he did not know about alleged misconduct towards women and girls by the office manager of the member for Hughes when there were court proceedings in July last year, there was a report in the Daily Telegraph on the 8th of July last year, media inquiries were made to the Prime Minister's office on the 3rd, 4th and 5th of August last year, and multiple reports appeared in the Prime Minister's local paper, the St George Shire Standard, last year?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I would invite the member to relook at the transcript of the answer I gave yesterday, Mr Speaker. And what I can say, Mr Speaker, is that on August the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th, it is indeed true, Mr Speaker, that an inquiry was made to my office about a matter that had been raised and dealt with in the Sutherland Local Court on the 8th of July of last year. That is correct, Mr Speaker, and that is a matter of public record. I haven't disputed that, Mr Speaker. I haven't disputed that that is a matter of public record, Mr Speaker. I said I would come back to the House and reply further on those issues on those dates, Mr Speaker. That is what I said yesterday, Mr Speaker. That is my understanding. And what I can tell the House is that following that issue, that this matter was raised This matter was raised by my office, Mr Speaker, both informally and directly in relation to the employment of the person who is at the centre of this, Mr Frank Zumbo, with the member for Hughes.
Members on my left, the member for Gellibrand, the member for Kennedy has the call.
Minister for Trade, China's contempt for free trade unapologetically cancelling all our coal exports. Surely this and the vanishing of Australia's secondary industries, inter alia glass appliances, oil refining, underwear, motor vehicles, all gone. Minister, hasn't this vanishing destroyed what little was left of free market credibility? McEwen's aggressive nationalistic trade policies created the Japanese market, replacing Britain's vanishing into the EU. Haven't the coal miners been the pathfinders, increasing global coal exports, finding the VIP new world, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines? Minister, who needs China?
The Minister for Trade.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question. And obviously the trading relationship we have with China is a very significant one for this nation, both for our coal exporters. It's worth $29 billion. When it comes to secondary industries, obviously through the great work that the Minister's doing with her manufacturing strategy, we're starting to make sure that our manufacturers are supported. And I just take underwear as an example, member for Kennedy. If you want to get some local underwear, you can go to the Beaufort and you can get very high-quality merino underwear in my electorate. There's Budgie Smugglers. Budgie Smugglers, another very good producer of underwear in this country. And of course, everyone would remember and should know about Aussie Bums. I hope you all know about Aussie Bums, which also produce very high-quality underwear. When it comes to our free market policies, can I say to the member for Kennedy, our free trade agreements now cover 26 countries, and we have taken the preferential access from 26% to now covering 70% of our markets. And he rightly mentioned Blackjack McEwen and the work that he did when it comes to Japan. And one of the great things that this government has been able to do is build on the foundations of that work that Blackjack McEwen did in signing a free trade agreement with Japan in 2014. Japan now takes 9.1% of our total trade. We're going to continue to pursue opportunities for Australian exporters. We're doing that at the moment with the United Kingdom and the European Union, and as the member for Kennedy knows, there was great disappointment amongst Australian exporters and especially agricultural exporters when the UK turned towards the European Union. And right now we're in the process of righting that wrong, and we want to make sure we get comprehensive free trade agreements with the UK. We also want to get them with the EU because we want to be backing our exporters when it comes to coal, when it comes to all our agricultural exporters, when it comes to services, when it comes to investment. And why do we want to do this? Why do we want to do this? Because trade creates jobs, member for Kennedy. 1 in 4 jobs right across this nation are created by trade. 1 in 5 right across this nation are created by trade. 1 in 4 when it comes to regional and rural Australia. That's why we're pursuing free trade agreement, because jobs depend on it.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on the Morrison government's JobKeeper program, and in particular how this unprecedented economic lifeline has helped millions of Australian families and businesses get through the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bonner for his question, acknowledge his background in small business, Mr Speaker, and as he reminds me, has been voted by his colleagues as the nicest guy in Parliament House, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, JobKeeper— apologies to the Speaker. The JobKeeper program has been a remarkable program. When Australia was staring into the abyss in the early stages of this pandemic and Treasury were warning that the unemployment rate could reach as high as 15% and there could be a double-digit fall in economic growth. The JobKeeper program came to the rescue, Mr Speaker. The JobKeeper program, at its peak, was supporting 3.6 million Australian workers and around 1 million Australian businesses. That's nearly one-third of all Australian workers and nearly one-half of all Australian businesses, Mr Speaker. Now, this JobKeeper program, which has been a rescue package for the Australian community at a time of need, has helped, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia, save around 700,000 jobs and has been at a cost of around an expected $90 billion. Now, Mr Speaker, as the economy has strengthened, we have seen thousands and thousands of our fellow Australians graduate off the JobKeeper program. And now preliminary data for the month of January from the ATO has shown that there are around 600,000 fewer Australian workers on JobKeeper in the month of January compared to the December quarter, Mr Speaker, and around 140,000 fewer Australian businesses on JobKeeper in the month of January compared to the December quarter. Mr Speaker, that means that around 2.7 million Australian workers have graduated off JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. Now, that is a sign of an economic recovery that is well underway, and that follows the unemployment rate falling to 6.4%, the underemployment rate being at its lowest level in many years, and up to 94% of the 1.3 million Australians who either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero at the start of this pandemic now back at work. So, Mr Speaker, there is a long way to go. There are sectors and regions across the economy that are still doing it tough, and the Morrison government has their back. There's continued economic support that continues to roll out across the economy, and our focus is on creating jobs, and that is what we're seeing right now in the Australian economy.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer. Did the Prime Minister ever raise concerns about the member for Hughes' office manager's dealings with girls and women directly with the member for Hughes? If so, when did he first do that?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can confirm that my office conveyed to...
the Prime Minister's
I've been going for 5 seconds.
The Prime Minister's 5 seconds in. The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can confirm that on the matters that I was just asked on the previous question and relates to the question the member has just asked, that on the 8th of July, Frank Zumbo appeared at the Sutherland Local Court. Mr Speaker, that was followed up by a request to my office about these matters. These were matters of public record. These were matters that were known. Now, as you would appreciate, at that time, that was the time of the second wave of the COVID pandemic in Australia. Mr Speaker, I'm just outlining the events of the time, and Mr Speaker, these matters were understood by my office, and my office raised these matters both informally and subsequently directly with the member for Hughes. It has long been my view that Mr Zumbo, Frank Zumbo, shouldn't be employed in the member for Hughes' office. He has known that. That has gone over a very long period of time, Mr Speaker. Our electorates adjoin each other, Mr Speaker. Our electorates adjoin each other. He has known about that. Has been my view for many years, Mr Speaker. Many years, based on our own conversations, Mr Speaker. Based on our own conversations. Now, Mr Speaker, this is a matter that has been ongoing for a very long time. And that relates to a whole series of matters, and most recently another matter, Mr Speaker, which I raised with him only very recently.
The member for Bass.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government's approach to meet the health challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic is working to ensure that all Australians can have confidence in our vaccine rollout?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Bass, in particular for her advocacy for the Launceston Hospital, as well as her support for measures taken to protect Australians during the COVID pandemic. Significantly, today is another day of zero community transmission nationwide, the 7th of 8 days, the 27th of this calendar year so far. At the same time, 10,000 lives were lost worldwide in the last 24 hours due to COVID-19. So the comparison between Australia and overseas could not be more stark or more graphic and more painful for all of those with connections to those who are suffering overseas. And so our containment approach has been fundamental in this. The border protection, the testing, which has seen over 50,000 tests in the last 24 hours, and I thank all those Australians who've continued to come forward. The contact tracing, where it's been required, which has continued to improve across all states and territories, and indeed the work of Professor Alan Finkel, the former chief scientist, in helping to oversee that has been absolutely critical in progressive, continuous improvement, along with the support of all of the chief health officers across the states. The distancing requirements. At the same time, we are focusing, of course, on making sure that our capacity continues to improve. And what we've seen is the arrival in Australia of vaccines and now the rollout. And we've outlined the one issue which has appeared so far today, but at the same time, we shouldn't lose sight of what's occurring. Monday was the first test day, and we saw 1,600 vaccinations approximately occur. We saw 6 aged care facilities, both of which were in excess of what we were expecting on the test day. Yesterday, the numbers more than tripled. We saw that those numbers were above 6,000 across Australia. Today, we're expecting another significant increase in terms of the vaccinations that have occurred. The aged care facilities yesterday were over 20, having come up from 6 on the first day, and today are expected to be in the order of 30, and they will continue to grow. And that's the significant thing, that the rollout was intended to start carefully, to continue to grow and to continue to grow, and we're seeing that already this week. And there are thousands of Australians who are involved in ensuring that we are seeing our nurses, we're seeing our doctors, we're seeing our health workers being vaccinated, our quarantine and border protection workers, our aged care residents, our aged care staff. All of these things are occurring, and that's the big story of what's happening in Australia, the confidence, the security, the next step.
The member for Gorton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. When did the Federal Police inform the Minister or his office of a reported sexual assault at Parliament House in March 2019?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. I was advised on the 11th of February and I've received updates last week and this week.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister outline how the Morrison government's Australian approach to industry and businesses is securing our place as a world-leading manufacturer of quality products as part of our plan to build a stronger economy and jobs?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and for her support of manufacturers in her electorate of Reid. And it's absolutely true that we have a world-class manufacturing sector here in Australia. It's diverse and it's cutting edge, and it has a reputation for producing high-quality, value-added products and goods. Now, from our very traditional heavy industries, which in itself is highly advanced, right through to our cutting-edge startups, we are taking on the world, and the outlook is overwhelmingly positive. And quite frankly, everyone right across Australia should be rightly proud of our Aussie manufacturers because they have done an outstanding job for us. Now, BlueScope Steel is a great Aussie manufacturer. one of our leading success stories and one of the world leaders in producing steel products. Now, they've announced that they are going to invest in expanding its Port Kembla smelter after recording a 78% lift in first half profits. Now, the CEO said Australian manufacturing is on the best footing he's seen for decades, and that in his lifetime he's not had the, and I quote, feedback and positive context out of Canberra. Now, as I've said, BlueScope is a fantastic Aussie story, but it's not just our traditional manufacturing companies that are feeling very positive at the moment, Mr Speaker. Last week in Canberra, I visited one of our space manufacturers, Skycraft. They are building more than 200 small satellites to improve our communications, our travel and even our banking. It's highly specialised, it's cutting-edge manufacturing. And like many other Aussie manufacturers, they looked at how they could build a supply chain from within Australia. And one of the businesses that they have been working with is a business by the name of Xtech, which is producing the special carbon fibre that they need for their satellites. Now, this is exactly what this government is wanting to stimulate through our modern manufacturing strategy. The $1.5 billion that we have committed to grow manufacturing here in Australia, and we are well on the way to delivering outcomes on that policy. So the first round of grant funding opened. It opened for the space sector last Friday, and we will continue to roll out over the coming weeks the programs for our other national manufacturing priority sectors. So that's resources, technology and critical minerals processing, medical products, food and beverage, waste and recycling and defence. Mr Speaker, we are absolutely playing to our strengths as a nation, and we will continue to do so.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. It's been reported the alleged perpetrator against Brittany Higgins used, and I quote, at least 2 detailed references to secure a job after leaving the Morrison government. Did any minister or ministerial advisor give the alleged perpetrator a written or verbal reference?
I'll hear from the Leader of the House if he's... The Leader of the House. Leader of the House.
I just can't see how that would be inside the personal knowledge of the Prime Minister or his responsibilities, Mr Speaker.
The member for Hotham will not interject. I'm going to now hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. I do have a problem with the question, but I'm going to hear from. And as I said, I don't write the standing orders. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, in terms of an issue not raised by the Leader of the House, but whether we can ask about ministers giving references or not, there have been a number of occasions, as you'd be aware, over the years where a minister providing a reference has been the subject of serious prosecution of issues within question time. The issue that the Leader of the House raised, whether or not that would reasonably be something that the Prime Minister would have personal knowledge of, I think, given that we're now in the 2nd week of inquiry of this particular issue, I think it would be extraordinary for the Prime Minister to not have knowledge of this.
Well, I'll just say before I rule on this, the point about whether the Prime Minister would be capable of knowing or not is irrelevant, because questions are asked, and either ministers have knowledge or they don't. I mean, that's just the way it is. There's no reasonableness test in that regard. The problem I have with the question, and I've been very liberal in terms of questions so far relating to a private member, that being the member for Hughes, very liberal indeed, and those questions have just been on the right side of the line because they've related to member for Sydney's questions in particular. They've related to previous answers, and because they've done that, it has broadened things to quite a degree, and it's broadened it for the Prime Minister to deal with those matters. The fundamental issue is the question of ministerial responsibility, and the writing of references goes to the working relationship people have had. A ministerial responsibility at that point, in a technical sense, wouldn't exist. I don't believe. I'm still happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. In terms of what someone does when they provide a reference, they're not simply providing a reference for themselves as friends of somebody. If a reference is provided by a minister, then it is treated differently because of their role on behalf of Australia, for which they are accountable here. That's what a ministerial reference is. Similarly, if it's someone from within a ministerial office, it has to be a reasonable line of inquiry for us to pursue whether or not the name of the government of Australia has been used to assist this individual getting a job.
Yes, the Leader of the House.
That in itself, and Mr. Speaker, I agree with your assessment about the relationship between a minister and
members on my left,
a minister and a staff member who became a former staff member. But leaving aside that issue and your preliminary view on that, what the Manager of Opposition Business just did then was reframe the question, and the question was, did any minister or ministerial advisor give the person in question a written or verbal reference? Now, at that point, you've got a question about whether or not a staff member gave a former staff member a reference, potentially written or verbal, with respect to a job outside government. Now, even if a minister were to try and inquire as to whether or not that had occurred, there'd be no mechanism by which you could receive properly an answer. I mean, it's just actually not possible to answer that question, I don't think.
And that may I think we're ready to move on. If people can stop interjecting, so I can actually rule on things. The point the Leader of the House made may well be a valid one, but it doesn't mean that a question can't be asked or is out of order if it seems highly unlikely in some circumstances it's possible to get an answer. I mean, questions can be asked. I am going to allow the question, but I think both the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business have pointed out, probably quite helpfully for people watching and for members of the House, the potential limitations of sufficiently being able to answer it. But I will call the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I have no knowledge of any such references, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, as I've stated in the House previously, as far as I'm aware, the only minister who had knowledge of an alleged sexual assault in relation to this matter was Minister Reynolds, Mr. Speaker. So that
Prime Minister will pause for a second. The next person who interjects will be ejected. As I've said on a number of occasions, interjecting during times like this, when you're expecting me to listen to the answer, is completely counterproductive. And you know what it does? It leads to a very long dissertation by me that wastes question time for your colleagues. Can I be more clear? The Prime Minister.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of any such references, and certainly in relation to staff members I would have no knowledge of that, of course, indeed ministers. But I fear, Mr. Speaker, that the imputation of the question is that ministers had some knowledge of an alleged sexual assault. And, Mr. Speaker, that apart from what has been declared in both this chamber and the other, it has been very clear that Minister Reynolds was the one who had knowledge of that event.
The member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And I direct my question to the exceptionally competent Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management.
The clock's ticking, Warren.
Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is continuing to build Australia's world-class emergency management services and disaster recovery capabilities?
The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question and would acknowledge the fact that the member for Leichhardt would appreciate more than anyone in this country coming from Northern Australia the importance and how lucky we are in Australia to have a world-class, in fact world-leading emergency services. And that is through the work we work with our states and through Emergency Management Australia is coordinating those mechanisms to keep Australians safe during natural disasters. And it's all predicated on the men and women who put their lives on the line for us, prepared to go out and put themselves in front of disaster to keep us safe. And many of those are volunteers. And tragically, last year through Black Summer, there were 10 emergency service personnel, the 34 lives lost in Australia, that have paid the ultimate price to Australia. And as a result, the Royal Commission has handed down 80 recommendations, which we're working with the states to implement. So much so that the government is making it very clear in a transparent way that we will be transparently showing the Australian people the progress of the implementation of all 80 of those recommendations and updating that on a monthly basis, so that there is a legacy to those people who paid the ultimate sacrifice, that this does not become one of the 240 reports since 1920 into natural disasters that has not been acted on. So we have a responsibility. And one of those recommendations is the establishment of a National Disaster Recovery Agency that covers not just bushfires but floods and droughts and cyclones, making sure that we look at resilience, the relief and the reconstruction of our communities. And so it's important that we do this as quickly as we can, and I can inform the House that we'll have it up and going by the 1st of July. And that means that we will coordinate with the states in a collaborative way to amplify our relief and recovery efforts. One of the other recommendations is about enhancing Emergency Management Australia, giving a greater capacity and capability. And part of that is around data and information, collecting that data. And so we're creating Resilience Services Australia, which brings together 10 agencies, whether they're Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, Geoscience Australia, to bring real-time data to Emergency Management Australia to collate and then coordinate information for particularly people in Northern Australia where a cyclone may be about to hit. They will be able to give our emergency services in Queensland and Defence Australia have been able to deploy assets strategically before a disaster hits. They'll also be able to work to the very household, the age of the house, the number of people in that house, so that we can work with NGOs and charities to ensure that the immediate relief and recovery is there. This is world-leading in making sure that we have a coordinated approach with those on the ground in the state, with NGOs and charities, in ensuring we're keeping Australians safe. This is what a smart country does in protecting its people in the good and the bad times.
Just before I call the next question, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon Her Excellency Ms Busady Santipataks, the Ambassador of Thailand. On behalf of the House, a very warm welcome to you. And I'd also like to inform the House we have present in the gallery Ms Jill Hall, a former member of this House for the electorate of Shortland. On behalf of the House, say welcome back to you. And I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the review conducted by the head of his department and his former Chief of Staff.
Sorry, could the Leader of the Opposition just start his question again? I couldn't hear the first part. Thank you. We'll start the clock again.
My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the review of the head of his department and his former Chief of Staff of what the Prime Minister's office knew about the reported sexual assault in March 2019. Why doesn't the Prime Minister just ask his staff and then tell the Parliament?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I have, Mr Speaker, and I've answered that question already. In terms of the knowledge
Members
of my
left.
staff of this matter, I've already answered that question on numerous occasions, Mr Speaker, and I've asked the Secretary of the Department, Mr Speaker, to undertake further inquiries to assure me about the advice that I've received, Mr Speaker. That seems to be a very practical thing to do, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, the Labor Party, have been asking me these questions for several days, and last week, Mr Speaker, I have answered them honestly. I have said that I have been advised when my office, Mr Speaker, knew of those things, and to assure the House, Mr Speaker, I have asked the department to provide further advice to assure me about the credibility of what I was told by my staff. Now, Mr Speaker, it is really getting to the point, Mr Speaker. I have been totally open with this parliament, Mr Speaker. I have been totally open about what is a very sensitive matter, Mr Speaker, a truly very sensitive and serious matter, Mr Speaker, and there are a number of processes we are now initiating together to address both the cultural issues here, Mr Speaker, and the support that is necessary in cases like this, Mr Speaker, that staff would need, or indeed a member of this chamber or a member of the other chamber, Mr Speaker. That is the issue here, Mr Speaker. That is what I'm seeking to address. There is a problem, Mr Speaker, for this parliament to deal with about the culture and the practices and support that are available to people who work in this building. I believe that is the case, and I think we need to address it, and I'm putting processes in place with this chamber, with the other chamber, to address that, Mr Speaker. Now, the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party continue to seek to point score on this. They can, Mr Speaker. That is their right. He can do this, and I'm happy to answer those questions, and I'm happy to have the reviews that I've initiated to address this very serious issue. But my focus, Mr Speaker, is on fixing the problem, Mr Speaker, and the rest of the issues, Mr Speaker, when they relate to political point scoring, I will leave it to the Leader of the Opposition to explain.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister please update the House on how Australia's world-leading waste and recycling industry is being transformed through the policies and leadership of the Morrison government?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you to the member for Higgins for her question. The member for Higgins is indeed a waste warrior. She recently called for a parliamentary committee inquiry into recycling, and that report, Rubbish to Resources, has just been handed down because everybody is talking about recycling, turning our trash into valuable assets. New processing and manufacturing operations that make a difference as the Morrison government continues to take practical action that reduces waste and increases our recycling waste. We said, Mr Speaker, we would ban the export of waste plastic, paper, glass and tyres, and we have, through the passage of Australia's first ever National Recycling and Waste Reduction Act last December. No longer will thousands of tonnes of mixed paper and plastic be shipped off overseas to be abandoned, burned or otherwise contaminate the environment. In fact, since the ban was agreed, exports of plastic waste alone have fallen by about 5,000 tonnes a month. The $1 billion transformation of our waste and recycling industry is well underway. We're seeing change. Change is happening everywhere, and it's driving results. 10,000 new Australian jobs, many of them in regional Australia, will come from this transformation, and 10 million tonnes of waste will no longer go into holes in the ground. Our Recycling Modernisation Fund is supporting investments in New South Wales, Tasmania, South Australia, Western Australia and Victoria, and I'm glad to advise the member for Higgins that the RMF investment in Victoria will give households confidence in their recycling. We're investing in a plastics reprocessing plant at Laverton, and it will deal with hard-to-process plastics such as you see in milk bottles, HDPE. This investment will see milk bottles collected through the curbside, going into the facility to be pelletised and then reprocessed back into food-grade packaging. This is bottle-to-bottle recycling, and that's why it's so important to encourage everyone to purchase bottles made from recycled plastics, because we don't just want to make recycled, we want to buy recycled. And the leadership and initiative shown by the Morrison government has given business the confidence to step up in this space. This morning, with the member for Brisbane, we were at McDonald's in Manuka and we held the last ever plastic straw from any McDonald's outlet anywhere in Australia. And our plastic summit last year encouraged McDonald's and other industries to step up and take the plastic challenge. And McDonald's has phased out 512 million straws used in its restaurant each year. The very last straw, Mr Speaker. Waste is not an environmental problem to solve, but it's an economic opportunity to create.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer. Why won't the Prime Minister guarantee the review by his former Chief of Staff will be released in full to the Parliament as soon as it is completed?
The Prime Minister has the call.
As I've already indicated to the House, Mr Speaker, I'm awaiting that report and I will report further once I receive it. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition—
Members on my left.
The Leader of the Opposition may not be aware, Mr Speaker, but the Australian Federal Police has advised the Department Secretary, Mr Speaker, that in relation to any of these matters, that any report here and the handling of any report must not prejudice any ongoing investigation into the matter itself, Mr Speaker. Now that is just the case, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister will pause
so
for
I'm
a
not
second.
going to do anything.
Prime Minister will pause for a second. The members for Eden Monero and others, I don't know why members would ask questions and then prevent me hearing the answer. The Prime Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, subject to these—
The Prime Minister will pause. The member for McNamara will leave under Standing Order 94A. I couldn't have been more clear. Prime Minister.
So, Mr Speaker, subject to these rule of law issues that obviously the Secretary would advise me at the time and any other such important issues that would have to be considered, Mr Speaker, I said once I receive the report I'll be happy to report further. I've made that very plain, Mr Speaker.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's Australian approach to ensuring our Defence Force capabilities are world-leading and keeping Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and thank him for his great support of our defence personnel, particularly those in his electorate. Mr Speaker, there are many countries around the world that can't afford to invest adequately into their defence personnel, into their defence assets. This country, though, is at the other extreme. We have put $270 billion into defence capability over the next 10 years. We've done that, Mr Speaker, because we've been able to manage the budget well. We've been able to respond to COVID in a way that many other countries around the world have not been able to respond, Mr Speaker, and it's absolutely important that we do so. We need to make sure that we have the adequate investment into our defence personnel and the equipment that they use, because we do face very difficult times. Mr Speaker, the fact is the Australian Defence Force is now with a 33-aircraft fifth-generation joint strike fighter fleet that is ready for operational deployment. We're acquiring 2 additional P-8 Poseidon aircraft to enhance our maritime surveillance and anti-submarine capabilities. We've down-selected the Arafura offshore patrol vessel as mine hunter and hydrographic survey vessels, which is a $5 billion program just in itself. We're investing up to $800 million to acquire new fleets of Australian-built amphibious vehicles and landing craft. And, Mr Speaker, we've selected the Apache Guardian as our new armed reconnaissance helicopter. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's defence budget provides a stable funding pathway for the next decade, and that is acknowledged by our military partners and our friends not only in this region but around the world as well. And people look to Australia for the way in which we can invest into our people and invest into the assets that we need to keep Australia safe and to keep our region safe, Mr Speaker. I want to pay tribute to the Defence Minister and to the Minister for Defence Industry for the way in which they have driven the investment so that there is a significant spend in businesses, in our electorates across the country. It creates jobs, Mr Speaker. When we talk about these billions of dollars, if you distill it down, it means componentry and parts are purchased from engineering firms and from those suppliers in the chain right across the country. Mr Speaker, at this time that is incredibly important because we want to make sure that as we recover from COVID, as we roll out the vaccine, we can get people into jobs. And that is the priority of this government. Mr Speaker, we will continue to make sure that we support our personnel. We know that their engagement with the businesses who are providing that equipment is absolutely essential. We have the best trained people in the world, and we intend, Mr Speaker, to continue to manage the budget well so that we can continue a record investment into that very necessary part of government expenditure.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that one member of his staff knew about the reported sexual assault 2 years ago, a second member of his staff said it would be raised with his Chief of Staff 2 years ago, a third member of his staff knew the alleged perpetrator had been dismissed 2 years ago, a fourth member of his staff checked in with Ms Higgins after Four Corners last year, numerous ministers were aware of relevant facts, and the Prime Minister had no idea about anything until last Monday?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've said repeatedly to this House, I first became aware of the alleged sexual assault on the Monday, the 15th of February, Mr Speaker. I'm advised my office first was made aware of this issue on the 12th of February, Mr Speaker. I've been very consistent on all of those points, Mr Speaker. And that is the record. That is my understanding of these matters. That is when I knew about it, Mr Speaker. Now, once again, the Leader of the Opposition can come to this dispatch box, Mr Speaker, and he can seek to state these matters and he can seek to point score on them, Mr Speaker. But the issue that is here is the issue that we all must address. Now, Mr Speaker, these matters, as we know, are not confined to any one side of politics in this building. We know this to be the case. So, Mr Speaker, I would suggest that as a chamber, Mr Speaker, that we remain focused on the main issue, and that is the changing of the behaviour that can occur in this building, and to ensure the protection of our staff and to ensure the supports are there to deal with these issues when they arise. Mr Speaker, that is what I'm committed to doing. I'm answering these questions openly, and I'm happy to answer them as often as the Leader of the Opposition wishes to ask them, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, I have told the House exactly when I knew about this matter, and that is the case. Now, Mr Speaker, if this Leader of the Opposition wishes to continue to seek to point score on politics on this issue, that is a matter for him. But as he knows, as the former member for Lindsay, Emma Hassar, has raised herself today, Mr Speaker, as she has raised today, Mr Speaker, if the Labor Party thinks that they have no issues to address regarding behaviour in their own party, Mr Speaker, then they are genuinely not understanding the seriousness of this issue.
The member for Barara.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney please advise the House how the Morrison government's world-leading counter-terrorism legislation is working to keep Australians safe?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question and for his good work on the Parliamentary Joint Committee into Intelligence and Security, and in fact for all of the work of that committee since we have been in government in 2013. And of all the challenges that has been faced by the government and by the Australian people since 2013, of their great variety, including COVID-19, one sad fact is that in 2014 the terrorist threat level was elevated to probable, and it has not changed from that level since that time, constantly at the probable level. And over that period of time, there have been 19 major counter-terrorist disruptions and 129 people charged with relevant terrorism offences. And that success is, of course, in its largest part due to the men and women of our outstanding security, police and intelligence communities. But it is also the case that the government has endeavoured to create for those men and women a world-leading legislative framework in which to deal with this very persistent and very grave problem. And since coming to government in 2013, we've introduced over 20 tranches of national security legislation, all with one purpose: to keep Australians safe. We were the first, one of the first countries in the world to grapple with the sudden rise of ISIL by passing legislation creating new foreign fighter offences and providing more tools for our security agencies to investigate, arrest and prosecute those supporting foreign conflicts. Following the shocking events in Christchurch, we legislated to ensure abhorrent violent material was removed from the online environment. We passed laws to stop our intelligence and law enforcement agencies from going completely dark in the fight against terrorism, laws that were used within 10 days of their coming into effect. But that work is ongoing, and as I've advised the House previously, our counter-terrorism efforts now face an equally significant challenge over the next few years, because there is a large cohort of convicted terrorist offenders, including those who were prosecuted in the aftermath of 9/11 and the Bali bombings, who are now due for release. There are 15 such persons due for release over the next 5 years, and regretfully, despite the best endeavours of all those involved, many of those individuals continue to hold on to the extremist ideology that motivated their offending, and they still pose a very significant risk to the Australian community. That is why the government has methodically been building a world-leading framework to effectively manage those persons. In fact, those laws were successfully used for the first time late last year when the Victorian Supreme Court made a continuing detention order against the convicted terrorist Abdul Ben Brika. And of course, very recently I introduced the Counter-terrorism Legislation Amendment High-Risk Terrorist Offender Bill, which will give yet another option to use with respect to post-detention regimes by virtue of a new intensive supervision regime known as the Extended Supervision Orders regime.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House 1 notes A. One member of the Prime Minister's staff knew about the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins 2 years ago. A second member of his staff said it would be raised with his Chief of Staff 2 years ago. A third member of his staff knew the alleged perpetrator had been dismissed 2 years ago. A fourth member of his staff checked in with Ms Higgins after Four Corners last year. Numerous ministers were aware of relevant facts, but the Prime Minister says he had no idea about anything until the story broke last Monday. B. Despite a clear call from Ms Higgins for an independent investigation into how her reported sexual assault was handled by the Morrison government, the Prime Minister has announced a review by his former Chief of Staff and refuses again today to guarantee it will be made public. C. The Prime Minister knew about the inappropriate behaviour of a staff member employed by the member for Hughes, but did nothing and now seeks to cover up his knowledge and failure to act. And D. Whether it is sports rorts, community safety rorts, Grassgate, Watergate, forged documents and matters as grave as bushfires, the pandemic and reported sexual harassment and assault, the Prime Minister always thinks about politics and never accepts responsibility. And 2, therefore, condemns the Prime Minister for always acting in his political interests instead of the interests of Australians.
Is leave granted? The Leader of the House.
Leave is not granted.
Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition.
You're going to shut it down again? Chicken.
Leader of the Opposition.
Seriously.
Members on both sides. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended, as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion immediately. That the House 1 notes A. One member of the Prime Minister's staff knew about the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins 2 years ago. A second member of his staff said it would be raised with his Chief of Staff 2 years ago. A third member of his staff knew the alleged perpetrator had been dismissed 2 years ago. A fourth member of his staff checked in with Ms Higgins after Four Corners last year. Numerous ministers were aware of relevant facts, but the Prime Minister says he had no idea about anything until the story broke last Monday. B. Despite a clear call from Ms Higgins for an independent investigation into how her reported sexual assault was handled by the Morrison government, the Prime Minister has announced a review by his former Chief of Staff and refuses to guarantee it will be made public. C. The Prime Minister knew about the inappropriate behaviour of a staff member employed by the member for Hughes but did nothing, and now seeks to cover up his knowledge and failure to act. And D. Whether it is sports rorts, community safety rorts, Grassgate, Watergate, forged documents and matters as grave as bushfires, the pandemic and reported sexual harassment and assault, the Prime Minister always thinks about politics and never accepts responsibility. And D. And 2. Therefore condemns the Prime Minister for always acting in his political interests instead of the interests of Australians. Mr Speaker, the greatest waste of money was on the empathy consultant
the Leader of the
for this Prime
Opposition
Minister.
will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
The member no longer be heard.
Leader of the House has moved the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.
Lovely, lovely speeches about free speech this morning. Always worked about free speech this morning.
How's that free speech stuff going?
Yep, someone did that.
Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the Leader of the Opposition be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Grey and Nichols. Tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Werriwa and Lawler. Tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 60. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for Sydney.
Mr Speaker, seconded. This Prime Minister is running a don't ask, don't tell government
the
of
member
cover-ups.
for Sydney will resume her seat. The Leader of the House.
I move that the member no further be heard.
The question is the member for Sydney be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats in this successive division unless they're changing their votes or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 60. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. I call the member for Griffith.
There is all cover-up and no compassion. He's all politics and no care.
Their seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that the question be put.
The Leader of the House has moved that the question be put. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Again, in this successive division, members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their vote or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 60. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition be disagreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it. Noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Lock the doors. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their votes or did not vote in the last division, in which case they need to report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 65, noes 56. Question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's Australian approach to our defence industry is creating world-leading defence capability and capacity, and is helping to drive forward our recovery from the coronavirus recession?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to get a question from my fellow West Australian, the member for Stirling, and I just want to acknowledge his many years of service in the ADF and thank him for his great interest and passion for Australia's defence industry. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's $270 billion in our defence capability is enabling us to create a world-class defence industry right here at home. Our investment is setting up business for export success, which is helping them to buy credibility abroad. And importantly, it's providing a pathway for those high-tech, high-paid and also those incredibly advanced jobs for generations of Australians to come. In my own state of Western Australia, we have a number of standout examples, Mr Speaker, and they demonstrate the impact this government's investment is having on us creating a sovereign industrial capability. And as we speak, Mr Speaker, we have hundreds of Australians who are helping us to bring Navy's next generation of the offshore patrol vessels to life down at Lursen in Civmec's big shed. And, Mr Speaker, it's interesting to note that Civmec have built the biggest shed in the Southern Hemisphere down in Henderson, and it is indeed something to behold. Mr Speaker, more than 300 Australian SMEs are benefiting from this program, with some building and enhancing their capabilities, which is truly exciting. But, Mr Speaker, this is more than just about building ships. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government's ambitious naval shipbuilding plan is about building a world-leading naval shipbuilding industry, and at the same time we're creating 15,000 Australian jobs. Perth-based Barrett Communications, Mr Speaker, is yet another example of how the Morrison government's investment is supporting and driving Australians' design and Australian manufacturing. Barrett is a state-of-the-art communications equipment company with customers across the country and across the globe. I had the pleasure, Mr Speaker, of visiting Barrett last year, where I saw firsthand their world-class Aussie ingenuity firsthand. And then in Melbourne, Mr Speaker, I mean, it's illustrative that we've got capability right across the country. We are partnering with Boeing to design and build the first military aircraft in some 50 years in Australia's history, and that's the loyal wingman. As the Prime Minister has said, our $40 million investment in this program is supporting 100 high-tech jobs and creating new capabilities in our industry. Mr Speaker, our record investment in defence is creating a world-class industry right here at home. We know during COVID many industries have done it tough, but let me tell you, the defence industry in Australia has stood up, and with our support we are creating more opportunities for Australian companies, and we are creating thousands of jobs at home.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the